Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Kicked off with a great episode of Julius Krein this past Tuesday, and now we are continuing our quest to delve into the big ideas that are going to define American politics moving into the 2025 year and the second Trump presidency. One of my favorite topics, aside from abundance, is this idea called state capacity. Basically has to deal with this question of to what degree can the American government, whether it's federal, state, or local, actually achieve the goals it wants. So if the Biden administration says we want to build thousands of EV battery charging stations, can we actually build them? If we say we want to build more ships for the Navy, can we actually build them? If we say we're going to spend $42 billion on rural broadband, can we actually deliver that in the first place? I think if we look back to the Biden presidency and the struggles to get political reward for the big bills they passed, I think it's really at the center of this state capacity challenge. Despite all of the billions of dollars of funding, the rural broadband wasn't delivered, the charging stations weren't there, the chips fabs did not go up, the money was not spent in ways that needed to be spent, and there was a real gap here. So I think if we're kind of understanding this podcast theme of focusing on the abundance agenda, we should understand that abundance agenda is about saying, here are our goals. We want to have lots of manufacturing. We want to have energy. We want to have costs get lower. The question that state capacity brings in is to what degree can the state actually do these things and how is it actually going to work? So with that in mind, I've got two great guests, my Niskanen colleague, Jen Pahlka and Andrew Greenway. They have a new report from Niskanen called The How We Need Now, a Capacity Agenda for 2025 and Beyond. Hope you all really enjoy this episode. And as with my episodes with Steve focused on the abundance agenda, this is going to be very foundational when it comes to the way the realignment is going to cover the next 4 years. So hope you all enjoyed the conversation, and a huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. Jen Pahlka and Andrew Greenway, welcome to the Realignment.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
So we're here to discuss a great new report the two of you put out via the Niskanen Center, The How We Need a Capacity Agenda for 2025. And I want to just start here with the actual title of the report. Titles sometimes don't mean anything, but the how part of this discourse is so key to our conversation. I think about, and I've talked about this on the show, political figures and people in the US are really focused on the what. So we're going to pass this legislation. We're going to have Medicare for all. We're going to fund this high-speed rail segment. We're going to do X, Y, and Z, but we rarely focus on the actual how part. How about you kick us off, Jeb, by focusing on why that word how is so critical to refocusing the way we think about policy in 2025?
Well, I think we're in a moment when the neglect of the how, this sort of sense that people with power have that that's somebody else's job, is really starting to show. It's wearing, right? Very much of the moment is the reporting on the Biden legacy, where so much of what was expected out of those four big bills just is still in process. I think the updated number on the number of EV chargers that were authorized in the bipartisan infrastructure law in 2021 is now 47. So it's gone up from 7 to 47. But that's just not enough. If you've promised something to the American public, and the bill BIL, itself was the what. The how is all of the gunk in the system, the clogging of the pipes that the folks charged with implementing Bill and the other three big bills are facing. And we have to pay attention to how now, across state, federal, and local government, because the how, the what doesn't matter if the how's not paid equal attention to.
Andrew, what I appreciate hearing from you is just like a good definition of the broad category policy we're talking about here, which is state capacity. This is going to be new for a bunch of folks. This is one of these like hot terms of the moment that like means something beyond its newsiness. So let's just get a good definition of state capacity for folks.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, my kind of definition of that, would kind of building on what Jen would say, was sort of is translating that political intent, that policy vision into reality that the public feels and experiences on the ground. And the machine and the bureaucratic kind of institution's ability to make the connection between those two things. And I think obviously 2024 was a year of elections both in the US and the UK. In the UK, we had the relative luxury of being fairly sure who would win. But again, that was a kind of a battle fought, if you like, in part on people not just sort of falling out of love with the government, but falling out of love with institutions and their ability to translate what people hear on the news and what their politicians tell them into things that they can see and feel the difference of. And a state that is capable is one that's able to do that, and the state that lacks that capacity is not able to do that, or at least not consistently.
And Jen, something I'm curious about, I want to pick up the EV chargers point you made. So folks first came across this discourse when Pete Buttigieg went on ABC News and he was interviewed about the fact that despite the billions of dollars that were allocated towards increasing America's EV charging capacity, they'd only built, quote, 7 or 8 of them. I love the or 8 in the original interview because it's actually, it wasn't, we are at 47 now, but it was unclear, even from a governmental perspective, how many had actually been completed. And obviously
that was that like 8th one being like, what is it? What's wrong with the 8th one?
No, exactly. No, thank you. I've yet to find the follow up on like the or 8 part, but I think that's a real part of the story here. And something I'm curious to hear from you, obviously. And when I say disastrous media appearance, like this it kind of went viral, but I don't think anyone was thinking about this when they made their decisions about their 2024 election choices. But I think it really mattered because I think it got at the key of, once again, to your point, the Biden administration's difficulty in translating the vision to the actual action here. And now that folks have been thinking about the post-November landscape, the discourse on the EV one has become a little complicated. So it's sort of, look, we said X number of chargers by 2030. So you shouldn't be measuring this by what we did in 2023 and 2024. We should be focusing on that end state. So acting in good faith, like that's a totally, I think, fair defense of what was actually happening here. Like judge us by what we actually promised. They never promised you would have 5,000 chargers set up by 2024. That said, what I worry about in that defense is to what degree is, let's say, that 2030 goal even wrong in the first place, in the sense of like, should we have been able to do more than we even promised? So even if we are on track to deploy those by then. So I'm curious, like, what you think about like sort of like the retrospectives and the recriminations when it comes to the EV charging capacity issue.
Yeah, I mean, the EV charging thing is like one issue that folks have settled on, you know, because it really tells a big story, right? Like, I drive an electric vehicle, and like the lack of charging stations is actually a problem for me today. It's also a big problem if we're trying to transition to a green economy, because the more charging stations you see, the more confidence you have in buying an electric vehicle. Like, yeah, if they all come on, if all, you know, the other 4,953 come online in 2029, like that's not going to accelerate the transition that we have stated as a goal. And so, yes, I think you're talking about you're using the word defense, and I think that is the right word. They're sort of defending something that just shouldn't have been set as a goal in the first place. By the way, you know, this is one data point amongst many. I think probably the bigger data point in the Biden legacy is that of the spending of those 4 big bills, we've only gotten half of that out the door. That's the recent update. And we'd all hoped it would be more. But if you care about a Biden legacy, and you're afraid of the Trump administration clawing the rest of that back, you have a really big problem. But, you know, I think that in general, my frustration with the Biden administration's sort of general stance on all of this how stuff, the implementation stuff, is really that they've sort of said, like, yeah, the stuff takes a while. We accept that. And we should set expectations. And I understand that because there is a bunch of, you know, process and procedure that people have to go through. But what I would have liked to have seen is we no longer accept that because the costs of all of those processes and procedures are too high. And so in parallel to trying to execute on these priorities, let's also try to streamline the system which is supposed to execute on them. And I don't think they did that. I think they accepted the status quo at a time when I find it unacceptable.
Yeah, and as someone who talks to a lot of soon-to-be former Biden admin officials, they really fell into a narrative trap because what's interesting about the Biden legislative project is that it was half policy, but half of a political project. And the political narrative articulation you started seeing in 2022 was, these are investments for the long term. And if we really think about our administration, this is a test of whether you could have this long-term vision for America and whether our short-term political system will reward a long-term vision. Once again, that's true. We see that sentence in a big op-ed, and that makes sense to us. But I just worry that too much, when you start with that idea, but this is all about the long term, you provide an excuse to ignore the how. If what you're saying from the start is, oh, well, there's no way we could finish this until 2030, therefore, and it's sort of like a side eye to the American people, if they just aren't really able to handle, if they're sort of addicted to TikTok and not really able to see that there's this long-term thing there, maybe this all won't work out. So that's where I'm just like very worried. I was worried about that even in 2022 when you see how political narratives can actually end up backfilling excuses in unhelpful ways. And Andrew, something I'm really curious about,
can I ask you that,
yeah,
Marshall?
please.
I mean, just two important things. One is a long-term view would have said in the long run, we need to pay equal attention to cleaning out these pipes because that is going to help us with all of our policy agendas. It's going to help people believe in government, which is supposed to, Democrats are supposed to be the party of government. So I do reject the sense that this is taking a long-term view. I think paying more attention to the how would have been a much more profound long-term view that would have benefited Democrats more. But the other point that I think gets missed is that the burden lands on public servants. Like the people charged with implementing CHIPS or IRA have been working 20-hour days, right? I mean, maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but they have been working so hard and they are so burned out. And we shouldn't accept that either. We should say, you've been charged with something really, really ambitious. Let's figure out how to make it a little bit easier so that you can get it done in a reasonable amount of time. But what we said instead was, there's a lot of barriers in your way. I hope you really like working nights and weekends. And the health of the civil service really does matter. And we've harmed it. People are really burned out.
And I've got a question for you in a second, Andrew, but I want to follow up on that, Jen. So here's where this becomes difficult, though. So I'm just sort of putting on my skeptical audience hat here. If we haven't spent more than half of the funds that were allocated, so like we're not spending money on the projects, what are those civil servants doing working overtime hours? I think that's the energy that critics of government are able to basically take here, which is like, okay, Jen, you're saying you're doing all this work, but the money's not being spent. What is happening from someone who's like worked in the U.S. civil service? Like, what are they doing?
Well, a million different things that are, procedural hoops that need to be jumped through that I don't believe are particularly substantive, right? They represent sort of safeguards and ways in which you have to check with a whole bunch of different stakeholders because there's like very diffuse sense of power and a real, politeness in government that you never want to piss anybody off in a different agency. But like to give you, two specific examples, I'm thinking like the CHIPS team, right? Trying to get money out the door. First thing they're supposed to do, right? They should put up a form so that companies can express their initial interest. Okay, you immediately hit Paperwork Reduction Act, triggered review. You can't put up that form without going through the PRA process, which is a minimum 9-month review by an office in the White House, right? Like that has limited bandwidth. To even put up a simple form that says like, what kind of project might you want to apply for under CHIPS funding? Now you can go through a fast track process on that, but like you've got to do all the extra work to like get the fast track approval. Then 6 months later, when you still have that form up and you're supposed to be moving on to steps 4, 5, and 6, you just stop, go back and redo it because your emergency authorization only lasts for 6 months. So that's a big chunk of your time that the team is going to be working on something that you already did 6 months ago. It's a lot of work to get through something like that does not get you what I think you most need, which is starting to get the signals from the market, right? Signals from the companies about what kinds of projects they might want to get funded and what kinds of concerns they have and what kinds of questions they have. You're just stopped. Like, don't talk to them. Another thing is hiring. Like, these teams were supposed to be like 300 people. You'd go in 9 months in, they had like 140. I mean, these are sort of vague numbers. And it's like, just look at the hiring process. It's really, really time consuming, difficult, and very often results in, a slate of people that you're supposed to choose from, none of whom were qualified because we used self-assessments and veterans preference to create that cert. You have these HR people looking for the candidates who have cut and pasted from the job description into their resume. That's who gets on the cert. That's not who's qualified. And so they can't even really get the team they need to deliver on it. And this is what I mean by just like, they're just churning these public servants. The metaphor we use in this paper is like trying to drive a car, and you've been told, drive this fast, right? Get from point A to point B as fast as you can. But the brake, the brake is stuck to the floor. The parking brake is on, like maybe there's a boot on the car. Well, what does that do? The engine is just churning, but you're not really moving. And I think that's been the experience of a lot of people who work in government in the past 10 years. And I think it needs to change.
And Andrew, coming from the UK, you can offer a helpful outsider, but also, I think the Brits are easily like our American cousins. So you're going to be fluent on like the sort of like dynamics here. I think one of the questions when it comes to state capacity, and we could expand beyond just the EV charging discourse here, we could focus on the other big headline people saw, which was the deployment of high-speed broadband to rural America. Billions of dollars were allocated. I think it was like $42 billion, yet it didn't get built up. The other part of skepticism you get from folks who are even interested in that mission, like let's provide internet access to people in rural America, is wait, like, why is the state in charge of this in the first place? Why is the American state doing EV chargers when GM, they have their own consortium, Tesla has its own charging station infrastructure. They're making this backwards compatible over the next few years. So even if you have like a Mach-E Mustang, you could use the Tesla charger. When it comes to high-speed broadband, why didn't we just send a contract to Starlink to provide that capacity? How do you think as a British person about this debate over what should the American state even be doing in the first place? Because it'd be easy basically to say, okay, Jen, Andrew, the state capacity stuff is interesting. This seems like way too hard to do in the first place. So let's just outsource these big missions to the private sector.
Yeah, and it's a really good challenge. And clearly the politics on that are slightly different between the UK and the US. But I think both the UK and the US have had an interesting relationship with outsourcing over the last sort of 10, 15, 20 years. Certainly in the UK, we found ourselves quite bruised by it at times. There was a lot of public service delivery that was outsourced to private companies in all kind of parts of the state, including healthcare and infrastructure, but also things like the probation service for people who are kind of coming in and out of prison, some quite fundamental social services as well as infrastructure. And I think that kind of, as part of a sort of a theory, if you like, new public management, came in quite a lot in the sort of 1990s and 2000s. And what we found quite a lot of the time in that was the way that those kind of contracts were kind of came about was as ever, some very clever people at the centre of government, some public servants, would try and capture the requirements of trying to deliver this system so that they could give those to the market and go, market supplier, please kind of go and deliver this for us. We'll hold you accountable through the contract. But there were two kind of fundamental problems that we ran into in the UK on a bunch of public services around that. One of them was because of those trying to solve those challenges, be they broadband rollout, probation services or healthcare, because they're so complex, trying to define all of those requirements for the market up front and then let those out as contracts over many, many years and for many billions of dollars wasn't just difficult, it was literally impossible. There's no way that you can specify those things to the kind of the level of detail and clarity that you require. By the way, with a moving target, because stuff changes over time, technology changes over time, social trends change over time. So those requirements are by definition going to be wrong. but you have to kind of maintain the fiction that, no, we can get this all right up front. We can figure this out and then give it to the market and then they can deliver it, even though it's a moving target. So that was sort of one category error that we made. And the other kind of category error that got made quite a lot in the UK when it came to that sort of outsourced type relationship was that, oh, well, if we give it to the market, they'll be accountable for when it goes wrong. And that's just not how politics works, right? That's just not how it happens. If the market doesn't deliver, and there were quite a few fairly celebrated occasions in the UK when it manifestly didn't deliver what it was kind of asked to do, who got the blame? The politicians did, because the buck stops with them ultimately. So that is not to say, by the way, that all of those things should be brought in-house for public servants to do. Clearly, that's not the case. And there are many, many things where the market, I think, has a really important role to play. And when we looked at some of the more successful projects and programs in the UK that were working in some of the ways that we described in the report, they had blended teams where you had really good public servants working alongside actors from the market, actors from civil society. And crucially, they were working in the same team. So if you turned up in those rooms with those people, you wouldn't really know who was from where. They were all there to ship whatever outcome that the state needed them to deliver. And I think seeing more of that kind of blended team where you don't have the kind of chucking it over the wall, that's, I think, one of the real changes that would drive not just the kind of the efficiency of the market, but that kind of sense of public purpose and public outcome from the government too.
And quick pause. Andrew, when you talk, your screen shifts a bit, so just careful on that. I don't want to give listeners, the YouTube people, vertigo. Okay, so resume, Jen, pick up.
That one of the things that outsourcing does is create another opportunity for a lot of bloated process, right? And if there's sort of one thing I think you might take away from the paper we wrote, it's that we're trying to collapse the distance between policy and implementation. And as Andrew said, it's not that everything needs to be insourced, but we're trying to move fundamentally from this waterfall process that has all these steps from here's a bill, here's the goal, to, here's the outcome that the public or companies or whatever is actually interacting with. Right now, what we have is this many steps down. It does not, there's no feedback loop. When you have the whole contracting and procurement process and oversight process stuck in there on top of all of the other pieces of, the steps in that waterfall, it's an opportunity just for even greater distance between the people who, set this goal, wrote the law or the policy, and the people who are delivering on it. And as Andrew said, there's ways to collapse that difference, when the team just is really blended and really working, but that's not really how most procurements happen today. And, to further add on to Andrew's point, if the companies get the blame because these things go wrong, we would see the companies who have been most responsible for huge failures not continuing to work in government. And that is the opposite of that is happening. CGI got probably the worst press you could possibly get in the world over healthcare.gov. They've done very, very well. They continue to get federal contracts and contracts in state and local government. They were one of the contractors on the FAFSA debacle, right? There really isn't any feedback loop that says, if you don't deliver, we're going to punish you and not continue to hire you. On a practical basis, that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I want to hit pause real quick on the healthcare.gov example because it's going to be a very useful. Because a concern I have is that right now the state capacity question is getting very sort of centrist coded when, from my perspective, if you are far left Bernie or right wing Trump, you still need to care about this topic. And I think the healthcare.gov example is a great one to get into. So I'll hit pause on that. But I just want to pick up on something you said, Andrew, because I think it's very helpful to think about. And this speaks to the difficulty of the position the federal government is in, especially if you're sort of a center left Biden person, where it's not just that we're debating the outsourcing of public services to the private sector. That's a very sort of 1990s, 2000s reinventing government sort of discourse. What's difficult for the Biden administration position is they weren't just debating, okay, we have all these different functions, they're inefficient, they're publicly coded. Let's give them to the private sector to be more efficient. But what the Biden administration did was, we have these big public-minded objectives. So EV battery charging stations to have a clean economy, rural broadband so we could have more access to the like digital goods that exist. So actually saying the question of who actually can best deliver that is a little separate from the traditional outsourcing one. And I don't think it's one that people are basically prepared for understanding what the cost of that actually is. But something I'd love to get into now, just to like really beat into people's heads, the importance of these state capacity issues and how they're going to actually see these sort of think tanky topics in their actual lives. You two helpfully included a bunch of stories and headlines at the start of the summary of this paper. I'll just read all of them off to you, and then I'd like you each to pick one of them that best articulates like what you sort of are motivated and you really see. So firstly, the U.S. Navy can't build ships. Second, new report estimates the U.S. has losses of over $233 billion annually. Tens of thousands of Afghans applying for U.S. visas still face major delays. The U.S. fast-tracked a power project after 17 years. It just got approved. And finally, how the VA fails veterans on mental health. So Jen, starting with you, just pick one of those like headlines you highlighted as just a good articulation of why this isn't just sort of like a think tanky wonky thing, but something that folks should really be interested in if they care about these issues.
I can't resist the Navy not being able to build the ships. I mean, if you may not think about national defense on a daily basis, but we're probably going to a lot in the next 4 years. And that what's behind that story is not just the classic. We did a bad job of building them. Like, though that is in there, right? These literal ships that came, 20 years later were very buggy. There was this whole, very detailed reporting about them trying to sail this ship and like it sort of falling apart, having to return to port on it, its first outing, which is just painful, given the, staggering amount of money that went into it. But the other piece of it is that when the Navy decided they needed these ships, it was so long ago that we were fighting a totally different environment, right? It was a different kind of war that we would be getting into. And they weren't just buggy on delivery, they were already unneeded. We are not worried about that kind of warfare now. And, when I talk about collapsing the distance between policy and delivery, like a part of that is just speed. Like, we just need to be able to move more quickly because the world is changing and what we need to deliver can't come 20 years later because it will have moved on. What we need now are like swarms of drones. Like, I mean, you probably know this way better than I do, Marshall, but like, we fundamentally are buying the things we needed 25 years ago instead of the things that will help us deter conflict with China and other adversaries. And so part of this how is the time frames that it takes are no longer acceptable, not because just that they add up a lot of costs and like it's frustrating, but because we literally can't do the job that we're supposed to do if we don't get faster.
And how about you, Andrew? What's one of the stories that sticks out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of feel slightly awkward as a Brit kind of picking a piece of US criticism. It feels like me being a bad guest, but just sort of taking it from that list. I mean, the US kind of the fast tracking a power project and they're taking 17 years to approve. I think that has a real resonance, not least because clearly almost every kind of major economy at the moment, not least the UK, is going through a fairly significant energy transition at the moment. And I think that headline really encapsulates something that that we kind of see all over the world in terms of some of the responses to this, which is almost, we call it in the report, that kind of cascade of rigidity, where quite a lot of rules have been brought in to ensure that the development of infrastructure is done with a kind of coherence and kind of systems level thinking that all kind of makes sense on paper. But those initial rules that are brought in by bureaucrats or legislators with perfectly good intent sort of metastasize into these things that then slow every single incremental step along the way to the point where you get what Jen is describing, which is essentially building infrastructure for the last war or the last kind of social state that we prepared to build these things in. And I partly kind of pull that one out because I think also the US remains in many ways this kind of beacon to a lot of other Western economies about its capacity to do this kind of stuff. When I talk to kind of friends in the UK and tell them that, I've been working with Jen on this report, and she says the Brits are quite good, and if not better than the US. What do you mean? These guys have so much more in terms of resources. They've been able to do these kind of fairly seismic shifts as a kind of major economy on things like infrastructure historically. We don't get it. What do you mean they can't do this? And I think so. The US, I think, can genuinely occupy a role as a kind of the global leader. It has the resources to be on this sort of stuff, and in areas like energy, that's probably needed more than ever.
And I think what I love about that headline, I think it's the most helpful headline to understand this issue, because like this is an episode that's really directed at policymakers. What I've really appreciated about most of my Niskanen focused episodes, like my ones with Steve Talley, I get a lot of sort of like incoming or current policymakers who are just like, oh wow, I'm just trying to help myself do my job better. And if I sort of put my sympathetic hat on, I can just imagine, let's say it's, 2008, 2009, Obama's in, they're doing all of the big post 2008 spending. I could imagine myself as a young congressman or a member of the administration saying, okay, we need to have this power plant happen. And they're like, oh, that's difficult. And I'm like, oh, don't worry. We're just going to fast track it. And then we would just sort of move on to the next thing. Like I actually know exactly how that headline came about, but just discovering that even the fast tracked version doesn't work is, I think, this like the critical takeaway from this episode, which is that even under fast tracking, under the status quo, it's still taking 17 years. So not only you're not getting a political benefit from that, but you're also not going to get any actual policy accomplishment if you're trying to actually get something done. So listeners of this show will know that I'd say my favorite era of American history is sort of the progressive era, late 1890s, early 1900s. So your report was right up my alley when you two openly write that this is really like this moment where there's a need for governmental transformation on the level of that early 1900s progressive moment. So we could take that moment, and then we could also focus on like the 1990s, where Al Gore, unlike most vice presidents, actually had a real portfolio where he was given the very serious job of reinventing government. For a digital era, you had the internet. He very much was coded as being interested in technology and those different changes. So Jen, how about you kick us off by just sort of articulating how this moment rhymes with the 1900s, what we could learn from, I think, the reinventing government moment, and then why, then Andrew, you could pick this up wherever you want to, why this moment, this incoming Trump presidency in 2025 really reaches the heights of those two previous moments.
Yeah. So I think the progressive era of the turn of the century has been really inspirational in the sense that we moved. The biggest thing I think that happened then, from my perspective, is that we moved from a spoils system to a real civil service. And think about what that must have taken. I mean, that, we think about changes to civil service rules today, and it's like, oh, that's so hard to have happen. Manage your expectations, but they literally went from a completely different system in which you got a job because it was a favor from a politician, enormous amount of what we would call today graft and corruption, to a modern professionalized system in which people got jobs on the basis of merit. And we really started to, get a handle on the graft and corruption. And we take that for granted today. But people fought very, very hard to shift the conversation away from what I understand to be sort of primarily, not exclusively, like monetary policy, which is very much a what, to the how of government, because it became very clear that was just going to be necessary to manage the impacts of, the industrial transition. So, I do think we really want to remind ourselves how hard that must have been then, and gear ourselves up for something equally hard if we're going to get this done in our era.
And just to pause real quick, because I think this is, once again, an obsessive era for me. People should think of like young Theodore Roosevelt when he is coming into government. His first federal job was as a U.S. civil service reformer. And if you read like The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, is he writing big, epic, gargantuan policy papers. No, like he's going into Ohio because the postmaster is appointed only because of if we think of like the things that should not be political, it's really the postmaster of some like rural part of Ohio. But that's what the spoil systems that's what they were like fighting against, and that's what they're transitioning in. So I think it's just like really important to understand like how weirdly nitty gritty these big issues are, and how we have to both balance the highfalutin, we need a civil service for the 20th century, industrial era, et cetera, with the realization what that looked like on the ground was, hey, they're firing every single postmaster when a Republican or Democrat comes in, and they're only getting these jobs, which are incredibly important back then and even today, obviously, because of their political affiliation. So understanding the balancing act of the nitty gritty wonky stuff with the highfalutin stuff is really important.
Yeah, and let me put another point in before we get to Gore, which is President Carter, been in the news a lot since he recently passed. And what I didn't realize is that, he was very personally involved in the Civil Service Reform Act in 73 or 78, someone remind me, to the point where he took time out from negotiations at Camp David for Middle East peace to make sure that it kept moving forward. Can you imagine a president of the past 20 years having put that much energy on something like civil service reform? It is literally unthinkable. It shouldn't be. We should have presidents who actually pay attention to this stuff because it is foundational to everything they need to do. But like the Civil Service Reform Act that Carter championed was really dealing with the core tension between protection of the civil service, which you need if you don't want this turnover that you just described in positions that need continuity, and you need people who can stand up and say, this is the right thing, have the independence that we value so much. But that has to be balanced with the need to actually be able to manage the workforce. And I think a lot of people feel like we got some of that wrong in the Civil Service Reform Act. But really, I think what happens is that we go through these cycles of paying attention to this stuff and then neglecting it, right? So in fact, what we're fighting against right now is some of the the tail of both the progressives and, what Carter did, and to some degree what Gore did. And it's not that what they did was wrong. It's that you have to continually refresh these things. You have to see how they're working out and adjust them because the world changes and because systems get increasingly sclerotic over time. Like they just all do. It's just like a law of nature. And they start to sort of pervert. And we have this, unfortunate system now where it's like we really don't have the ability to manage the workforce in the way we need to. I mean, just one quick thing about the reinventing government under Gore is that, it was people point to it as having had some success. I think it was an interesting timing because it was just very early in the digital transformation. So much changed after that. And we just haven't gone back and updated things for the society that we live in today, which is so different from the Gore era, even though it's not that far in the distant past.
And Andrew, can you speak to the current moment then? Because obviously this is time to coincide with the new Congress and the new administration. Like, what about this moment sticks out from a state capacity perspective?
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly to build on Jen's point, I think it's worth kind of underlining that idea that there will be a reformed civil service, and we kind of do that and we're done. Like that's just not going to be the thing. And I mean, look, just harking back to history very briefly, when the UK went through its version of the progressive reforms in the sort of 1850s and 1860s. That is now kind of looked as the founding document of the bureaucracy in the UK, but that took at least 15, 20 years before it stuck, and people hated it. Queen Victoria was very unhappy at introducing the meritocratic principle to these positions and kind of wondered where it stopped, that kind of thing. So these things take a long time, a lot of sweat.
And she wasn't wrong from a certain perspective. We could see the debates. That's one of those ones where I obviously disagree with her, but we could see the big debate about reforming the House of Lords directly. Like once you introduce merit, there are going to be some implications to the British aristocracy.
100%. And I would happily do an hour on that. But to bring back to the kind of why is this a moment? I think there's a couple of things really. One is like I think certainly in the UK, but I'm sure large parts of the US as well, there's a kind of this growing sense um, in the centre, but I draw that centre pretty broadly, where people are genuinely worried that institutions are not helping people win political arguments anymore. People don't believe in those institutions, regardless of the incumbents that are sitting in them. They could be blue or red, it doesn't really matter. And I think certainly the sort of the new Labour administration in the UK is very conscious that it's not really kind of trying to win the 2029 election against the current opposition party, which is pretty broken, to be honest. It's winning it, trying to win it against a kind of a more populist front that is just basically pushing a message. All these suits are all the same. It's just kind of different coloured rosettes. And one of the kind of the reasons why I think this is such an important moment is it's about rebuilding people's faith that those institutions can deliver stuff that citizens can see and feel and that is meaningful to them. And I think the kind of the other thing that's sort of part of this picture too is there's that kind of, and I'm going to butcher this quote, which is bad because it's from a kind of noted American, but Eugene McCarthy, I think, said the only thing that saves us from the bureaucracy is its inefficiency. And I've never really been a particularly big fan of that quote because regardless of how big you think government should or shouldn't be, and there's a kind of obviously a very wide spectrum of answers to that, whatever size it is, I want it to be good. Like, I don't really care about, there are lots of different opinions on how big, how small, but it needs to be effective in what it does. And so I think that's quite an uncomfortable discussion to have at the moment with an administration coming in when you don't feel comfortable with the what. You're not actually keen on the policy direction that an administration might be taking. And there's a real temptation, I think, if you're on the other side of that divide to go, actually, you know what? Let's not fix the how right now, because it might actually help this lot be more successful in driving their agenda in a direction we don't want to go. And I think that's quite insidious and quite dangerous because that fundamentally undermines the game for everybody. And in the medium to long term, that's not going to work out well.
And what I have to add here, because I really care about this section. So there's been the left version of state capacity and then the right version of state capacity from a pitch perspective. So there's been a lot of discourse after the 2024 election where I'm about to interview Senator Chris Murphy tomorrow, where more left-leaning parts of the Democratic Party have really focused on, look, we need to reorient ourselves towards the working class. Like, we need to provide healthcare. We need to do all these different things. And what frustrates me about this conversation is there's just this real lack of, once again, to start where we began the episode with this like how question. And Jen, you talked about, healthcare.gov and how botched the rollout was. And what I don't see enough people on the left reckoning with is like, let's put aside the political theory here of like, you get elected, there is a political revolution. I think that the lack of engagement with the question of like what happens when the American state tries to provide universal health care in a single payer, Medicare for all version, and then you get some form of the healthcare.gov debacle, but it would obviously be very, very scaled up. I think that obviously is sort of the status quo assumption of what we should assume happen. That would provoke the type of backlash that happened with Obamacare and set the legislation back a couple years, really put it on the precipice of getting overturned. So I know that the leftists who listen to this podcast are not going to be the type of people who are going to sort of go to the Niskanen Center because of how centrist quoted it is. But I really want the left to get interested in this how question. We could set aside the do we want universal health care or not question, just this how question. So can you kind of give your pitch to why the sort of big government centric left should be interested in the state capacity question? Because I just have not seen in all of the sort of left-leaning Biden retrospectives any real interest in this side of this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Biden legacy problems speak to themselves, and they're going to continue to get coverage, and I think force some recognition of the need for this agenda. But as you both just referenced, it's coming at a time when I think your Britishism of not too keen on the other side's agenda is like rather understated. Our political,
it's my brand.
Yeah, not. I'm a little bit. I tend to be a little bit less understated and say that it's true horror at the agenda, and so it's very hard for the left to engage in that conversation for the reasons that Andrew described. But we are in a podcast called the Realignment, and so I just get a lot of outreach today from folks on the left saying, What you're saying is really important. It's really not something our party is dealing with. And where do I sign up, essentially, for this like new version of the left that cares about delivery? And I don't really have an answer for them. And you and Steve have talked about this a lot, like as it relates to abundance. There's not like a plate. And I guess, I listened to your episode with Misha Chellam where he sort of complains about this too. Like the ideas are all there and the organizing isn't. But I think it is to some degree Marshall selling itself to the left.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good to hear. Like all different parts of the left. It's just that there is nowhere for those people to go yet to say, this is the version of the left that I want to support. It's where I want the Democratic Party to go. I see the problem. How do I organize in this way? Because the as we say in the left, the spaces, right, are still, they're trailing by 5 years.
And Andrew, I'll please continue.
Sorry, if I just build on that briefly, Marshall. I mean, one of the things, and I wouldn't like to necessarily speculate whether this is the case in the US too, but the left or right, there's definitely been a noticeable gap in this discourse between people like in the think tank world, the wonks who talk policy, and the people who actually do delivery of public services at the front line. And left or right, one of the reasons why I think this agenda has often failed to kind of get resonance in the kind of conversations in Westminster, on the Hill, or the kind of the usual bubble where conversations about policy, and I use that word advisedly, happen, is policy people talk to policy people. They're not talking to people who deliver stuff.
Right.
And that is a real issue. And it's not just the people who are on the front line operating services, it's the technologists, it's the different tribes who are all involved in getting stuff shipped that seem to not interact as closely. And I think that's also true of the political class. So one of the things that multidisciplinarity, if you like, about this conversation is also really important, because unless you kind of collapse that, you're just going to get people swapping increasingly good ideas that are untethered from what it actually means to deliver something.
Yeah, let me give an example. I mean, I got an outreach from someone who's a very noted leader in the problem of solving homelessness nationally, nonpartisan, but certainly coded left. And it's like, if you are actually trying to solve that problem, if you are spending enormous resources getting down in the weeds about how hard it is for city and county and state governments to even track the homeless population, the data problems, you will encounter very much all 4 of those key principles in our paper: that the people in government, can't hire, that they are drowning in procedural bloat, that they critically do not have the digital and data infrastructure, and that there's no feedback loops between the policies that local governments set and like the outcomes that they see, such that they can adjust and keep, moving towards improvement. And so I completely agree with Andrew. It's the folks to whom this idea sells itself are the folks whose hands are dirty, actually trying to solve problems on the ground.
And Andrew, something I'm curious about, once again, we'll bring in your outsider perspective and very much welcome it. We won't be triggered by anything you have to say about the state of American politics, but let's talk about the right. I'm very frustrated by state capacity conversations with the right, because it's one of those situations where immediately people on the right who've listened to these episodes don't like the title, because obviously it's the state. And if you're sort of on the right now, despite the realignment, you are increasingly skeptical of the state, and you don't see your job as making the state able to do things. You see your job as about reducing the power of the state or finding ways for the market to accomplish goals you're interested in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then broadly, what also makes this difficult from a right-leaning perspective is half of the pitch isn't there, because if you're pitching this to someone on the center, left to left, you're basically saying like, look, you want to do a clean energy transition, you want to increase rural broadband, you have to care about this how question. But if you're on the right, you're less interested in the how question, with the noted exception, once again, though, of national security. So the people I've had the most productive conversations on the right with about state capacity have been people who wake up every day and think about the number of ships we can build and how fast we could build them. They are people who are focused on the drone question. So I do think the right-leaning part of this pitch has to start with national security and defense. That's just like my takeaway from the past 2 months. But I'm curious how you think about how the right, and then we'll get to DOGE, of course, Jen, as we're like near the end of this. But let's just like get your perspective on how the right intersects with state capacity debates.
Yeah, I mean, in the UK, arguably this sort of started in earnest in 2010 under the previous administration, which was very much at the centre right. And one of the kind of the key arguments that was made as part of that, coming back to outsourcing in part, was that government was incredibly frustrated at a series of suppliers, often technology consultancies, absolutely taking them to the cleaners. Like, fully anti-competitive practices, oligopolistic behaviour on behalf of a market that was trying ostensibly fulfilling public sector contracts. And that was firstly quite a compelling argument because at the time we were kind of running a deficit, it was a period of austerity, we were trying to cut state spending, taking it off the kind of consultancy bill was one way of doing it, particularly given the terrible value for money we were getting from it. But the other thing that was quite interesting about that was that it came alongside quite significant procurement reform, particularly around digital and technology, which opened up public sector contracts to a much wider market, and actually a market with smaller firms and local firms. So a bunch of UK firms got contracts with the government, often sometimes in the constituencies where the politicians were, which kind of helps. But it actually kind of used the market as an engine for growth and that kind of public sector money to do that. So I think there's something about that interaction that is quite compelling of the centre right, not just in those kind of defence and security spaces where I agree that's the kind of the most natural constituency, but actually across a whole sweep of public service delivery, changing and reframing that relationship, which is routinely delivering dreadful value for money and market failure, frankly, within government. I think that's quite compelling.
And Jen, now I'll throw the question to you and ask about the most obvious example of the right engaging with state capacity, which would be Elon and Vivek Ramaswamy's Department of Government Efficiency. I'm in this weird place where I basically don't like any literal application of DOGE as late. It's sort of one of those things where it's my big problem with DOGE is it basically seems to be dedicated to repealing the 20th century in a way that actually like doesn't actually sync with Trump. Trump's whole thing in 2016 is he was the Republican who made peace with Medicare and made peace with Social Security. And if DOGE is basically just sort of a backdoor way of saying we're going to be 1980s Republicans and just sort of like cut spending in areas that even the working class base of the Republican Party really cares about, that seems to be off to a bad start. But I do love the idea of DOGE, though. Like you get some of these critiques of DOGE where they're like, wait, DOGE is basically fake. DOGE is basically just like, it's not everyone has no power. It's like, but it communicate. It's such an excellent communication means. One of my friends is in Nashville. He worked at the Department of Labor under Trump. He's going to clerk on the Supreme Court. He started his career at AEI. He's very engaged in these spaces. He was at like a random house party, and all of his friends were like, "Man, you're going back to DC next year. DOGE, it's crazy. DOGE just communicates something that I think things like the U.S. Civil Service Reform Commission in the 1890s really worked. I don't quite have the name here, but I think if we could rerun the Biden presidency, I would have loved if there was like a Department of State capacity where does it actually have any power? No, but it's very public. It's very obvious. You would put someone like Elon Musk on that commission. You do those different things like that. So I'll just ask, what are your thoughts on DOGE? And then what are lessons, though, from a communications, just making these policy things clear to people that I think state capacity reformers can take from just how much attention it's gotten in a way that's saying, don't worry, we've really appointed this, super effective person at the Department of Commerce just wouldn't no one's talking about that person at the, house party in the same way.
That's true. That's not going to come up at the house party. And he really is like a cultural phenomenon. So as somebody who's been working on, maybe slightly different branded or different framed, but the same issue for a really long time, it's like a complete supernova into my, this space that, yeah, as a very mixed bag. And as a Democrat, it can feel dangerous in the way that Andrew has described. Like, you don't want state capacity in the hands of the other party, but like I have to hold myself accountable to that principle that we actually just need state capacity. And if it comes on the other guy's watch, well, guess what? It's probably then going to be strong by the time, Democrats come back into power, if and when they do. But I think the thermostatic nature of elections, globally right now sort of kind of suggests that they might. DOGE in particular, like, we don't know what they're going to do. And I don't think they necessarily know what they're going to do for a whole lot of reasons. One thing I would call out is that you can almost track Elon and Vivek like learning in real time. Like, Vivek has said some like really dumb stuff, like, firing half of the civil service workers on the basis of, their social security number. That's just a terrible idea. Right?
And to note, he used that as a way too cute way of getting around civil service protections, right? Yeah. Like that was the origin of like why you would do that.
Yeah. And like he did an interview, I want to say like just before the holiday break with the editor of, I was an Aspen Forum thing, and he was so much more sane in that. And he was very clear, for instance, that like it is not within DOGE's power to cut Social Security or Medicare. Like that's Congress's job. And it's like, oh, good. Somebody gave Vivek a civics lesson, right? And I actually don't think I don't think it's necessarily just that he's learning. It's that he is in a different position, is saying different things because he's going to have to actually deliver something. Whereas he said the crazy Social Security number comment when he was on the campaign trail, just trying to like get headlines, right? But Vivek, I do think there's some evolution of Vivek's learning about what's possible and what they could actually do. Oh, by the way, what he said is like, no, we're not going to cut that. We're going to look at the fraud. Well, he's not wrong. Like the fraud is a really big problem. It should be a problem for the left and the right. And it is all those four things that we talked about that would fix it: being able to hire the right people, cutting the procedural bloat, significantly the digital and data infrastructure for fraud. And of course, having better feedback loops. So that's actually pretty smart. And then you can really, really see Elon, who has less of a background in government, learning in real time. Like he's tweeting out things about the civil service system. Like one of them was a retweet of me, which was hilarious. He's tweeting about things like how we do procurement being insane. And everybody who's lived in that world for all this time is like, oh, I'm so glad you're learning this. This is our lives. It's really difficult, but we don't know where they're going to land. We just know, as you said, that it's suddenly on everyone, in every conversation, whether you're, in university or at a DC cocktail party or like, across the country, everyone's talking about that, which I think has to be a good thing. And I have kind of ended up in this weird position of looking like the left's only DOGE defender. I'm not actually defending DOGE because I have no idea what they're going to do. What I'm defending or trying to promote is the notion that we need to be talking about government. If you want to call it efficiency, I'm going to call it efficiency. You could call it effectiveness. You could call it reform. We called it digital transformation. But we have to be talking about that. And as I said at the top, like the left needs to be talking about it. And we should want them to succeed. And I think the most controversial thing I've said is that it is actually possible that they will come up against all the forces of the status quo. It's actually quite likely, right? There's a lot of people who don't want government contracting to change. There's a lot of people, who don't want to cut procedural bloat. Like every rule, every contract, every, word in the federal acquisition regulation has its champions. There's constituents for everything. And I think it's if you're on the left to say, I'm really terrified that DOGE will succeed. Well, succeed at what? We don't know what they're going to do. It's also like, I'm actually really terrified they'll fail in a certain sense, because that would mean that our system is so resistant to change that even two extremely uninhibited billionaires with sort of unchecked power, they're not even going to be like necessarily ruled by like FACA rules. Even they can't change our system. They may change the system in ways that I don't want, but I do want to know that our system is changeable. And I'm really worried that the answer is going to be that it's not.
Yeah. And I think part of the learning here too, and this is why, I'll join you as we few, we happy few idea of DOGE defenders. Like you actually want to have American politics centered around this big question in the same way. Once again, like late 19th century politics was centered around this question of like, what is the purpose of government? What does the civil service reform look like? Like, I want the 2020s to be centered on this question of like, to what degree can government achieve the goals it wants to have? I think part of my other problem with DOGE, though, is that I think the word efficiency isn't just a sort of like word choice. I think it means something in a direction that's sort of unproductive. As in if efficiency is just defined as like government smaller, well, that doesn't necessarily answer so for example, if the things that Elon is going to talk about as he learns more, procurement, he's talked about the drones, he's talked about the shipbuilding. Well, firing half of people by means of not just like the too cute Social Security things, but just the other things, it's not going to actually help you address those questions. So that's why I'm just going to always go back, even though it's going to be less topical, it's not going to sort of roll off the tongue at the, house party perspective. State capacity just is the right term for understanding basically, let me put it this way. If the DOGE guys want to say publicly that they're all about efficiency, like that's fine. But I think the actual like Monday morning meetings have to be centered around state capacity when they focus on the things they actually care about, because I think that would lead them to an effective set of like solutions and approaches versus dead end ones around efficiency that are actually most of the efficiency things they care about are kind of like outside of their like purview. That's Congress. But it's also ones that like no one appointed Elon Musk to be the person who adjudicates. The richest person in the world is not going to be the person who's able to come to an American settlement on entitlement reform. It's just not going to happen. No. You should not. Whether or not you agree with the status quo,
is going to solve Middle East peace. It's not going to happen.
You can't touch that. What he can touch and what he actually has the right background to do, him standing up the gigafactory, in the west of the country when no one thought it could happen, like that's great for shipbuilding. That is great for blockage and paperwork. Focus there. That's where you're going to get the big wins. So as we're nearing the end here, I do think we need to center ourselves on the report. Could the two of you, Jen, we'll start with you, just sort of like offer up like what are the takeaways for left, right, and center for people who are interested in delving more into this topic?
So we start the report with what I jokingly call the recitation of the maladies, which is like, what are the core dysfunctions that drive these problems? And I won't go into all of them there, but I think, what I've heard from people who work in government since the report came out is like, yes, those are all the right things. Like I live that. That is a real thing, like the cascade of rigidity, for instance, that Andrew talked about. But then we have the middle part, which is like, where to focus and how to break this down, because it seems like such a huge topic. It seems like such a enormous hill to climb. Like, how are we going to do this? So we break it down into, if you want a government that can achieve its policy goals, you have to be able to hire the right people and fire the wrong ones. You have to reduce the procedural bloat that makes them, focused on the wrong things. And there's a bunch under that, including sort of reducing the surface area for attack by actors who sort of weaponize those procedures, not in the public interest. And you can tell a story about that. The 17-year approval process for the power plant certainly wasn't all government dysfunction, right? It's a lot of government creating the ability to be sued to stop those things. The third thing is you need digital and data infrastructure that we just aren't good at yet today. And then the last thing, which we have talked less about, and there's a great diagram, but we're not visual here, is transitioning from that waterfall to an ability to close the loop, not just in the executive branch, where we've been working on that for the past several years. Like how can we be more iterative so that if something's in the process of being implemented, we're learning from users and adapting along the way, but actually have that feedback loop include the policymaker and lawmakers themselves sometimes. So it's a new way that the executive and legislative branches need to communicate, need to have like affordances for ongoing sort of, check-ins that I think solve a lot of problems, but it's a really, really big lift. And essentially it just derives from the realization that you have a broken model in the executive branch for implementation. You have a broken model in the legislative branch they shouldn't both try to do their own thing. They should come together so that you actually can come back and circle around as something's being implemented, and not just executive branch, but the legislator also learns what that team is learning. And so there's a bunch under each of those four. And at the end, we have very specific things that both the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the sort of think tanky civil society world could do to make these come to fruition.
Andrew, how about you just close us out on takeaways the audience and people want to delve more into this stuff should focus on?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key takeaway for me, building on what Jen's outlined in the recommendations, is the point that we've been coming to a lot in this conversation, which this needs to be a wide conversation, right? This is essentially in an incredibly wide group's interest. And I'm kind of very conscious that, in the UK, our equivalent of DOGE a few years ago was a guy called Dominic Cummings, who you, I dare say you may have kind of come across before as a chief of staff under the Boris Johnson administration, made civil service reform one of his big kind of missions. One of the world's angriest men, but like his diagnosis of the problem was pretty good, but because of the nature of his character and kind of how it played out, it ended up actually toxifying quite a lot of discourse and discussion around this topic for a long time, which was a problem because it then becomes harder to regenerate the momentum and the kind of quite broad coalition of voices and forces you need for this to work. So I think what we've been talking about a lot today around that kind of need for both left and right to come to the table, arguably for different reasons, but ultimately sort of driving towards the same kind of outcomes of building state capacity is really, really key. And I think if the audience of this takes nothing more than that, it's that looking sideways, both across maybe both sides of the political spectrum, but also down through the sort of delivery cycle of the different tribes who are going to be involved in allowing the state to deliver what outcomes the public need, be they on the private or public sector side, but also right through delivery, policy, and technology.
That is an excellent place to end. The report is linked in the show notes of this episode. The how we need now, a capacity agenda for 2025 and beyond. Jen, Pahlka, and Andrew Greenway, thank you for joining me on The Realignment.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.